Hi, you're listening to the Grace House Podcast. We are a little country church in Clinton, Arkansas, and our mission is to glorify God in love and worship, to love one another, to teach and equip disciples for Christ, to encourage the church to do something great for God, to saturate the earth with the gospel so that multitudes will be saved. Thanks for joining us, and here's our pastor, Terry Simpson.
This has been a very sweet time. Very sweet time. The speaker of the hour is Kim Trujillo. Come here. Come on. Yeah. Give her some encouragement. Yeah, that's right.
And those of you in the band, if you want papers, they're up here. All right, so I want to preface this with saying that if this goes wrong or if I have any troubles, it's all Terry's fault for bragging on me this morning. So I blame it all on him before I get started. My husband asked me before I came today, he's like, so why are you so, you're not usually this nervous. Like, what is wrong with you? And I said, I don't know. But I think part of it's Amanda's not over there in my spot. And then Terry bragged on me and that just hurts me. But here we go. All right, so I think a lot of you are like me. You were missing church because, this is, I think, the biggest group I've had on a Sunday night. So I think y'all are like me. The Christmas holidays were great, but, man, I missed church during all that time. We needed more church. All right, so here we are on January 3rd, already of 2026. So we're only 3 days. Oh, it's the 4th. See, he's already messed. Looky there. The very first words out of my mouth, and I'm already messed up. It's got to get better from here. All right. January 4th, and we're 4 days into the new year. Oh, my goodness. Okay. So if you're like most people, you may have created a New Year's resolution, or you at least know someone who has, okay? And so, all the normal ones, you want to be healthier, you want to eat better, you want to exercise more, you want, more faith, you want to read your Bible, whatever, okay? But I'm going to guess that by tonight, 4 days into it, see, there's 3 mistakes in 2 paragraphs. Some of you are already weakening on your resolutions. You've already missed the Bible study time, or you forgot to pray, or you definitely did not exercise this morning, or whatever, okay? And here's probably why. It's because when we make resolutions, we're really doing it because we want change. But we're kind of wanting gradual change because we know ourselves. We know we can't do it immediately, So we think, well, I'll make the change for 2026. So I'm expecting in the whole year, I'm going to do all this better. But, we want manageable steps. But that's not how God works. God tends to want us to have a giant transformation, almost like overnight sometimes. Or he wants a complete change of directions. Or he wants us to step into the unknown. Okay? So if you were here the last time I talked, we talked about wrestling with God. And we talked about Jacob and Jesus and how they both wrestled with God. And we saw that there were 4 S's. We had struggle, searching, surrender, and then you had a scar that was left over. So tonight I want to kind of continue on with that thought, but this is going to be more what happens after wrestling. Because, you can wrestle with God all night like Jacob did, or you could wrestle for 2 years like I did. You'll get to find out about that story in a little while. But at some point you have to actually get up and walk.
That's right.
You got to step. You got to take those steps into the new direction that he's leading you. Okay. And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the word nevertheless. So in the Bible, the word nevertheless is kind of that pivotal moment of when you start to take that step. Okay. So the word nevertheless means in spite of all that. So in spite of all the things that have gone on before, or despite what has just been said, all right? So it's almost like a hinge word. It's like a door swinging open. So it's like a hinge between your circumstances and your faith, or between wrestling and walking, or surrendering and then finally acting, okay? And this morning when Terry was talking, I thought, that kind of goes along with what he's talking about now too, about the disunity and the unity. So like, I know this morning he was talking more about the unity within the church, but we also have disunity or unity with God. And so when we're wrestling, that's the disunity part. Okay. And then the nevertheless moment we're going to talk about is more the unity. It's where we're connecting to his will and we're saying, not my will, but your will. Okay. And where he goes, I will follow. All right. So tonight we're going to be talking about steps. So I made a little acronym. I like all those. So the S is going to stand with struggle with God. So that's kind of where we left off last time. And that's where you're going to be facing your reality. You're going to be telling God, I understand this is how things are, and I understand this is what you're asking me to do. Okay. Then T stands for turn your will to his. So this is the actual nevertheless moment. So in the Bible, sometimes it'll say nevertheless, sometimes it'll say but, sometimes it'll say yet. Okay. So all of those mean the same thing. And so it'll say, not my will, but yours. It's that moment of surrender. Then we have the execute moment. This is the actual physical moment where you pivot and you start heading off in the direction that he wants you to go. Okay. So this is when you obey. And then the last step is P, which is proceed forward, because, he doesn't ask you to obey in like just a 2-second moment that it takes you to turn. He asks you then to keep walking forward. And so sometimes that new direction, it could be for a week or two, or it might be for years and years, or the rest of your life. Who knows? So we're going to look at 5 examples. 4 of them will be from the Bible, and 1 of them is mine. So last time I talked about Amanda's journey to this church. And so tonight you get to hear my journey. So, all right, we're going to start with Jonah though. All right, so if you'll turn to Jonah 2:4. So Jonah's story is really, his whole story is kind of a wrestling match with God, because in the very first chapter, God tells him to go to Nineveh and to preach and to tell them that they're living wrong and that he's going to destroy them. Okay? And immediately, he doesn't say anything, but he turns the wrong direction and he runs off as fast as he can the opposite way and gets on a boat thinking that he's going to get away from God. Now, Jonah didn't just kind of fear Nineveh. It wasn't that he was afraid to go necessarily, although he probably should have, because, they were the enemy. And so it would have not been a fun time probably. But Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, which was Israel's enemy. And so he hated them, literally. He wanted God to destroy them, not give them a chance to repent and possibly be saved, because he knew that, God just said, go and tell them they're going to be destroyed. But he knew God better than that. He's like, no, that's not what's going to happen. I'm going to go talk to them, and then something's going to happen, and they're all going to get saved. I just know it. And so that's why he decided he would take his chances and run elsewhere. So he was kind of, morally outraged. God, you're asking me to do something that I don't feel is right. Like, this is wrong. You should not be letting them off the hook. They are bad people. They should die. Okay. And we all know what happened. He gets on the ship. There's a storm. He gets thrown overboard. He gets swallowed by a giant fish. Okay. And so it's in the belly of the fish that he takes his step. Okay. So you can take your step anywhere, even inside a fish. All right. So first of all is the struggle. So this is where he admits to what's going on. So he's in complete darkness. So can you imagine? Just picture yourself inside a fish. Do you think there's any way that light's getting in there? No. Okay, unless he opens his mouth. Water's all around him, and it's not clean water. It's got to be nasty. Okay. It even talks about how there's weeds wrapped around his head. Okay, so he is not having the best 3 days, and he's facing death, and he knows it's his own fault. Now, how many times have you been there? Yeah. Struggling with God, knowing it was your fault, not his. So this is consequence. This is that reaping what you sow kind of thing. Okay, so he feels completely separated from God, and he's at his breaking point at the bottom of the ocean inside a fish. Okay, and he knows that God's his only solution. So this is where he has to turn. All right, so this is his nevertheless moment, which is in verse 4. And depending on which version you have, some of these, I don't know, they didn't read quite like this one, but this one says, I have been banished from your sight, yet, which means nevertheless, I will look once more toward your holy temple. Okay, so this is his moment where even though he feels separated from God, he says, I'm going to turn back to you. Okay, so he's basically surrendering himself to God mentally, saying, I don't want to go there, but I'll do what you ask because you're the one that told me to. Okay, so then he has to do the execution. And so he has to act on that decision. And so if you notice in verse 9, so he's in the middle of a prayer. And he says, I will fulfill all my vows, for my salvation comes from the Lord alone. Okay, so he says, basically, he tells God, I will fulfill the vow. I will do what you have told me to do. Okay, and so at that point, that's when then God has the fish spit him out, vomit him out. And God then tells him, I still want you to go. And so in 3:3, Jonah obeys the Lord's command and he goes to Nineveh. And so since he proceeds in obedience and does what he's told to, even though he grumbled and complained, so we have to kind of overlook that part for this to fit into my sermon. But he did take the steps. He did do what he was told. And 120,000 people repented and were saved. I mean, that's pretty good. Yeah. All right. But what if you're not running from God? What if instead you actually want to obey, but everything in your experience and everything logic is telling you this is not going to work. What God is asking me to do, there is no way that's possible. Okay? So this is in Luke 5:5. So in this section, Peter and his crew, they've been fishing all night. They hadn't caught a thing. They're exhausted. They're up on the beach. They're cleaning their nets. And Jesus comes up and there's a whole crowd of people with him. And so Jesus tells Simon, let me go out in the boat and I'm going to preach for a little while. And so he does. Okay. And so then Jesus says to Peter or Simon, I want you to go back out in your little boat and I want you to put your nets over on this side and I want you to catch some fish. And Peter's thinking, what in the world is he thinking? That's crazy. Like, one, fish are best caught at night at this time of the year. Two, you've been preaching so long, it's now noon. Like, there are no fish when it's hot outside. What are you thinking? And so like he's running all these things through his head. Like, there is no way this is going to happen. And you want me to do this in front of what? This big crowd of people that just saw me come in with nothing? Yeah, right. But he turns and he says, Master, we worked hard all last night and didn't catch a thing. But, so there's our nevertheless, if you say so, I'll let the nets down again. So notice he tells him, he tells Jesus, this ain't going to work. I don't know what you're thinking. But, okay, so even when you think that things aren't going to work out the way that God says they're going to, you can still have that turning moment, okay, where you're trusting God more. All right, so he has to execute this. So now he has to actually act on that decision. He has to gather up all his nets again. He's got to gather up his crew. He's got to push the boat back out into the ocean or the sea. And then in front of every single person out there, because they all stood up there and waited to watch and see if he was going to catch anything. He had to then throw the nets over and see if he was going to get anything. And he does. So he doesn't just like dip the net in and go, well, I tried and it didn't work, so I'm going to go home now, Jesus. Instead he fully commits. He throws the nets in, and then the catch is so massive that they have to call another boat over so that they can put the rest of the fish in there. And then that boat almost, capsizes too. So from that moment on then, that's when he calls him to follow him and to become a fisher of men. Well, yeah, now he's going to believe him for sure. He just caught 1 million fish. I mean, yeah. All right. So Jonah had the physical ability to obey God, and Peter had the resources to try whatever Jesus was going to ask him to do. But what if you lack results, or don't just lack results? What if you lack everything? What if you are empty-handed? What if you are weak or sick or your resources have failed. You're broke. Okay? What if you have nothing to work with? So turn to Habakkuk 3:17 through 19. I'll give you a second because that one will take you a little longer to find. And I looked his name up, and there were like every single website that I looked at had a different pronunciation. And I was like, I'm just going to say it however I feel like it then, because I don't think they know either. All right, so he is a prophet during Israel's collapse. Okay, so there was violence everywhere. The economy was failing. Everyone there was sinning, every possible sin you could think of. The Babylonians were fixing to invade. And he's been wrestling with God, basically saying, why aren't you doing anything, God? Like, look around me. Like, what do you expect me to do with all this? And God, instead of saying, well, you just hold on a minute, I'm going to save you and all the people, God basically says, it's going to get worse. It's going to get way worse before it gets better. You might as well just, hang in there. So this is when Habakkuk takes his step, is in the middle of nothing looks like it's going to come out right. Okay. So if we look at chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. So this is kind of at the end of his prayer, and he lists everything that's gone at the moment. He says, even though the fig trees have no blossoms and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty. Okay, there's nothing there. Like, they don't have any food, they don't have any income, total economic collapse, there's a famine going on. He is literally staring at empty hands and going, what's up, God? I don't get it. And so for his turn, we know he can't turn from his circumstances because God's already told him it's fixing to get worse. It's not going to get better. Okay, so those are going to stay true. But instead, he has to make the decision of what his perspective is. All right. So he says, if we continue, even though all these things are true, yet, there's his nevertheless, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes me as sure-footed as a deer, able to tread upon the heights. So he had absolutely nothing, yet he rejoiced. Okay? Everything had failed, yet he praised. Okay? So this is that mental choice that you make when you say, you don't look around and say, well, what's missing? Instead, you look around and say, who remains? Because God's always there. So this is when you find joy not in what you have, but in who you have. All right, so to execute this decision, he had to actively open his mouth and worship. He had to physically lift his hands to the Lord. He had to speak those words. He had to lift his hands, even when his hands were empty. And so he proceeds in confidence because as the end of his prayer goes, he says, the Lord is my strength. Okay. So now we get to my story. All right. Mine is more the opposite of Habakkuk. So instead of lacking, I actually had comfort. And we've all been there before too. All right. So in some ways, this is actually a harder step than the other three that we've talked about so far. Because, when you're rebelling like Jonah was, you at least know you're wrong and God's right. And so it's not that hard. It's hard, but it's not that hard to go, okay, God, I'll do, you can bow your head and move on. And when you're like Peter, when your logic fails, you can at least go, well, I know that God's smarter than I am, so let me do what he says, And of course, when you have nothing, where else are you going to go? That is when you do reach out for God the most, is when you're completely desperate, okay? But what about when you're comfortable? When you're established and you're settled and everything is familiar around you, okay? And God says, I want you to leave. I want you to leave that comfortable place for somewhere where you're going to have to depend on me. That's when it gets hard. All right. So Amanda and I went to church together for quite a long time. I was actually there longer than she was. I was at that church for 26 years, more than half my life. Okay. And that church was my family. Like, I literally think of those people as family to me. And it also was my identity. Okay. I taught a ladies class that I absolutely loved because I got to teach it however I wanted to and, do what I wanted to with it. And those ladies were like really my family. Okay. And then I typed up the bulletin, the weekly bulletin. And I loved doing that because I got to figure out what little stories. We had just enough little extra space on one spot because, I had organized it. So we had enough little extra space that I looked for little cute stories to put in there or whatever I thought that the congregation needed to hear, that kind of stuff. So I had complete control over the bulletin. My husband was an elder, which made me an elder's wife. Ooh, I had prestige. All right. I helped organize the potlucks. I hosted parties at my house. Every February, we took 40 teens to Christ Teens in Russellville for a weekend at a time. And so, I had lots of control. All right. And, this is where I raised my kids. And our friends were there. So there was a lot to be comfortable about. Okay. But for 2 years, Amanda and I felt like God was telling us to leave this church. And there were many different reasons. But, that second year, it really got hard because you could really feel the weight of Him telling you to go. But your brain was going, why? Why would you want me to leave? This is my family. I have things to do here. I'm serving you. I'm loving you. There's a lot going on here. And my husband is not going to leave. He's lived here since he was 11. He's been there since he was 11. This is his home church. This is his home. He's not leaving. Okay. And so that meant if I did leave, I was going to have to do it all by myself. So even though Amanda had already decided, still, you're just a friend. It's not the same. So for about a year, every time we went to church, it felt like an endurance test. So basically, my beliefs were not the same as that particular church's beliefs. But for 24 years, I was able to set that aside and have unity because you don't have to agree with everything that everybody in that church believes to be able to be a family. Okay. But there was this one preacher and he tended to preach on just the things that I disagreed with. And it's like he harped on them and I felt like he was pressuring some of us in the church to change and be more like and agree more with what they were thinking. And it's really hard to have something, crammed at you like that every single week, 3 times a week. And so I voiced my concerns to several people, and I will admit I complained. I'm a complainer. I complained quite a bit to several people. But I did speak to some of the elders and nothing ever changed. Okay. So my breaking point came when, if most of you know, I'm the one who takes notes and have my little table over here. Well, there I didn't have a little table, like Amanda brought me the table. But over there I didn't have a table, but I still took notes. Furiously as anybody spoke. And so there was one Sunday where the preacher preached the exact same sermon that he had preached about a year before, along with the same exact PowerPoint pictures and words on the screen. Exactly. And I was the only one who noticed. And so I went home, and being the note taker that I am, I dug through all my notes and found the exact one and laid them side by side and went, yep. And that was my moment. I was like, I can't do this anymore. There is no change. There's not going to be a change. And this is kind of killing me, because when you go to church and you're mad every week or you're crying every week, that is not the place for you. Okay. So I realized also something else, kind of in retrospect. So Deuteronomy 8:11. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I've kind of got pieces of it. But it says, "Be careful not to forget the Lord your God. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, your heart will become proud and you will forget the Lord your God." So during this, that's kind of what happened. Like, I was very comfortable in all my roles in the church and with all the people in the church. That was my comfort zone. Okay. But I was forgetting God when it came to my spiritual life, because I was spending all my time complaining and griping about how nothing matched up. Okay. And so I had been comfortable for 26 years. And so I had to decide, are you fixing to do your nevertheless moment and say, God, even though I'm comfortable, I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to turn and I'm going to go somewhere else. And that's what I did. So I surrendered and I said, okay, God, I will go to Grace Church, because I had been coming with Amanda once in a while, like on Wednesday nights. So my execution moment, I didn't want to leave the church on bad terms. So when Terry talks about that, I always think, oh, thank goodness I didn't. Okay. But so I decided I needed to speak to the elders and just let them know why I was leaving and what was going on. And I will say too, I did not make this decision by myself. My husband was in on it. We talked about it, and he had to agree with me and allow me to go, because he was going to have to step down as an elder, or he felt he needed to, if I left. Okay. So it wasn't just my decision. He allowed me to go. But anyway, I decided I'd talk to the elders. And so, I worked up this big long thing of what all I was going to say, because, I didn't want anyone in the church to be able to start rumors about me and think of why I wanted all the ones who needed to know the real reason why I was leaving, because you know how gossip can go, especially in a church. So we met one afternoon in the fellowship hall, and this was COVID at the time. And so I sat at one table, and they sat, one of them at each of the other little tables all across the room. So they were pretty spread out. And for 30 minutes or so, I poured out my heart. I wanted them to know this was not a rash decision. I had been thinking about this for 2 years. I wanted them to know how I felt, what I thought, all the stuff. And, how I felt spiritually dry, and how I felt like it was really God telling me to go. Okay. And that I wasn't just following Amanda because she was my friend. But anyway, so I read through all my notes and talked to him and cried quite a few times. But anyway, because this was really hard. I mean, to tell your family, basically that's what you're doing. You're telling your family, it's not, I'm disowning you, but hey, I'm going to move away and not see you very often. I'll come see you like once a year, when you were seeing them 3 times a week. Yeah, it was hard. But when I finished, I felt like this weight lift off of me, because I had obeyed God and had done what I was supposed to do. Okay. And I had bared my soul to them, and there was nothing that I had left unsaid. So I felt pretty good. And so then I said, well, do any of you have any questions? Because, if I need to clarify something, or if you didn't understand or whatever. And so there was silence for a minute. And then one elder spoke up, and he said, "You mean to tell me that the people at Grace are not wearing masks when you worship?" And I just looked at him like, I just bared my soul to you. I just told you everything that's bothering me, and you are wondering about mask. So that made my decision a whole lot easier. I wiped my tears, and I'm sure that there were a few other questions, but that's the only one that stands out in my mind. And isn't that the way things are too? You only remember the bad stuff. But anyway, so I got up and I walked out. But if you've looked at your steps, that's not the last step. The last step is proceed. So it's one thing to tell them you're not going there anymore. It's another thing, now you have to go to the other one. Okay? So now I had to come to Grace. So I had been coming. I felt kind of comfortable. I will say, here's the funny part. Standing for 4 songs just about killed me for the first year. Literally. Because we sat for songs. And so the song service was really long to me. Sorry, Tanya. But I'm used to it now. You have to build up your endurance. But seriously. But anyway, so I was no longer this random visitor. Now I was someone who wanted to be a member. And that's totally different. Okay? And I will admit, because I had forgotten. Because when you've been there for 26 years, you forget what it's like to be the newbie. Okay? Yeah. It is not easy. It is very, very hard for an introvert to come to a new church. Yeah. Okay? And it wasn't anything against any of you. You were all very friendly and nice. But I felt like an outsider for about 2 years. I'm going on year 5, so I feel pretty comfortable now. But for a while, it was really, really hard. Okay? But I knew I had to keep coming, and I needed to get involved, and I needed to make friends, and then I found some ways to serve. And I will say that now that I've been here 5 years, my cup overflows, and I feel pretty comfortable, and I'm very glad that I stayed. And God doesn't necessarily. Well, I just said I feel very comfortable, and then I started to say, well, but I'm not very. Anyway, but I'm still growing. I'm comfortable, but growing. Let's put it that way. So. The only really hard part still is not going to church with my husband. And the first time when I practiced this, I bawled like a baby when I got to that part. But anyway, I'm not going to tonight because I'm over it. But it is very hard to go without your husband and to have different beliefs so that when you go home, it's still hard to even, we'll randomly say, well, how was your service? Oh, it was great. How was your, It's sad not to share that part. But moving right along. All right. The next one, this is an even harder step. And thankfully, I've not had to do this step before. But, all the other steps were difficult that we've talked about, all the examples. But at least all of them had some level of hope with them. Okay? So like Jonah, he hoped that God would save him out of this fish. Because he knew that God really wanted him to go do this. So he kind of thought in the back of his mind, I'm pretty sure he's going to rescue me because, otherwise who else is going to go do this for him? And, Peter, I'm sure, was hoping that the nets were going to be filled because, hey, then he's got some money, then he's got, he's working his job. All right. And it makes, Jesus look. Habakkuk hoped that God was going to sustain him throughout all the bad times. And I hoped that God was going to lead me to the right church, and he has. But what happens if there is no hope? What if your obedience might actually cost your life? And there's no guarantee that God's going to save you. Okay? So there might come a time when you have to step toward the fire, even though you don't know if God's going to show up or not. So that's what happened in Daniel 3. You'll turn there. Daniel 3. See, I think I put verses in here just so that I can get drinks. And I really appreciate all the other people that get up here and get drinks too, because it is really hard. All right. King Nebuchadnezzar had built a golden statue, and he commanded everyone to bow whenever the music was played. And if you didn't bow, you were going to get thrown into this blazing furnace. Okay? But there were 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refused to bow. And so when they were brought in front of the king, he said, well, you'll bow or you'll burn. And, what God's going to deliver you out of my hands? And so, with all these other stories, they all had a little bit of time to wrestle. Okay. I had 2 years to wrestle. They had like just maybe 10 seconds to wrestle, because he pretty much said, you will, or right now we're fixing to tie you up and put you in the furnace. But they knew before they even got there what their answer was going to be. So in verses 16 to 18, 3:16 to 18, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you have set up. So this is a really big nevertheless. Okay.
Yeah.
So they had already decided way before they even came to this situation. Okay. Because if you read the word and it says to do something, then when that situation comes along, you do it. All right. So the execution part, they had to actually verbalize this that they already said, and then they had to physically stand there while they were tied up and dragged across the room and thrown into a furnace. Okay. So they didn't know that there was going to be a fourth man. They didn't know if they were even going to survive or how the story was going to end. They probably actually thought they were going to die, because, can you imagine thinking, oh yeah, God's going to save me from this? No. But they had God's word. Do not ever worship an idol. So they couldn't, And so in verses 24 to 25, it says, Suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? Yes, your majesty, we certainly did, they replied. Look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted, I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god, because Jesus himself had showed up. And you notice then in the story that they leave the furnace. They're called out of the furnace. I bet that was weird for King Nebuchadnezzar. Here, come on out, guys. That's probably never happened before. And when they came out, they didn't have any burnt anything. They didn't have singed hair, and they didn't even smell of smoke. So God had delivered them spectacularly. All right, we're getting close to being done. All right, so if you think about it, if you put yourself in these situations, have you had any of these moments like the 5 that we talked about? Or are you going through one of them now? So maybe you're like Jonah, and you already know what your Nineveh is for 2026. You know exactly where God's calling you to go, and you've already said, please don't make me. Okay? Maybe it's something as simple as forgiving someone who's hurt you deeply, or having a hard conversation with someone that you've been avoiding, or maybe he's asking you to serve or witness in some way that's going to cost you. And maybe you've been running, maybe not as dramatically as Jonah did, but maybe you've been so busy or distracted or just making excuses so that you don't have to do whatever it is that God's asking you to do. But maybe now's the time. Maybe God's saying, now you're going to do it. And you're going to say, okay, I know what you're asking. I don't want to do it, because it's okay to tell God that. He already knows it. And you're going to say, nevertheless, I will obey. And then you have to execute it by actually going or forgiving or having that conversation or serving or witnessing, whatever it is he's asked you to do. Or maybe you're like Peter, and maybe you're afraid of failing again. Maybe this is something that, you tried once and it didn't work out. And you're like, I'm not doing it again, Lord. I already know it's not going to work. We already tried that. Okay. So maybe he's asking you to give when your bank account says you really can't afford it. Or maybe he's wanting you to repair a broken relationship and you've already tried once and it didn't go well. Or maybe he's wanting you to commit to something even when you can't see how it might work out in the end, because our logic doesn't match his understanding. And so your nevertheless moment would say, well, my logic says no, or my experience says this isn't going to work. But if you say so, Lord, I will obey. And then you're going to be like Peter. You're going to pick up those nets and get in the boat, and you're going to maybe write that check or make that call or do whatever it was he asked you to do. Or maybe you're like Habakkuk and you have nothing right now. Maybe you're lacking success or resources or strength or provision, and you've just got empty hands. Well, even with empty hands, you can praise and you can worship. Okay? So in that case, your nevertheless moment's going to be, I have nothing, everything's failed, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Or maybe you're like me and God's calling you away from something that's comfortable or something familiar. Maybe it's a job you've had for years, but you know that it's really not the best one. Or maybe it's a relationship that's comfortable, but it's unhealthy for you. Maybe it's a church or a pattern or a routine, and you know that being comfortable has led to complacency, and complacency will lead to spiritual death if you're not careful. So in that case, you need to say, this is familiar, this is comfortable, this maybe is all I know. Nevertheless, I will follow you wherever you lead me to go. All right. And then the last one, maybe you're like the three in the fire, and God is asking you to obey without any guarantee of how it's going to turn out. You don't know if he's going to rescue you. You don't know if you'll survive. And you sure don't know how the story's going to end, because none of us do. Okay? But you can say, God, you might not rescue me the way I hope. I might actually lose everything. But even if you don't, I will not compromise. I will stand my ground and follow you all the days of my life. All right. So in case you are standing at the edge of your own nevertheless moment tonight, you might have been wrestling for a few days or months, or you might have been like me and you've been wrestling for years. You know what God's been asking. You've probably felt that little tug or heard that little whisper or sensed some sort of call, but you haven't moved yet because you're just waiting for something, because we want those signs, don't we? We want that certainty or that comfort, or we want the fear to go away and feel the peace fall over us, or we want our circumstances to line up just right. God, I'll do it when this and this and this and this all line up. But your circumstances are never going to line up perfectly. Never. And the fear is never going to fully disappear. And you'll never have complete certainty about how things are going to turn out, because otherwise, that's what faith is. Okay, so Jonah didn't wait until he loved Nineveh to go talk to him. And Peter didn't wait until all the people had left before he went out, so he didn't have to do this in front of everybody. Habakkuk didn't wait until the barns were full. And I didn't wait until I felt comfortable, that's for sure. And the three boys didn't wait to see if God was actually going to save them. They all took their step in the middle of the struggle. Yeah. That's a biggie. So it's in the middle of the struggle. It was while he was in the fish. Remember that. Yeah. So some of you need to hear this tonight. Your nevertheless moment isn't about having all the answers. It's about making the decision to obey despite not having them. It's not about feeling ready. It's about being willing. So remember that in all of the stories that we looked at, every single one of them, the person took the step first and God showed up after. Yep. So Jonah decided to obey, and then he commanded the fish to open his mouth. Peter let down the nets, and then Jesus filled them with fish. Habakkuk chose to praise, and then God gave him the strength to walk on the heights. I walked through grace's doors, and then God filled my cup. And the three boys stepped into the fire, and then the fourth man appeared. So God is not going to show you that fourth man. He's not going to show you Jesus till you take the step, because he meets you in the fire. He meets you in the struggle, okay? So what's your step going to be this year? Maybe you already know it. Maybe it's been nagging you for months. Or maybe you came here tonight and God now just brought it to your mind. So don't wait another year or another month or even another week. Take your step, okay? And then do the hard work of executing it and then proceeding. Keep on with it, okay? Because the wrestling is important, but the wrestling isn't where the transformation happens. The transformation happens in the step. And 2026 won't be different just because the calendar flipped over. It'll be different if you take a step. And I'm done. Yay. So just the one mistake. All right.